A slap in the courtroom. 3 minutes that would shake the very foundations of the city. Yet, the recipient of the slap was none other than a member of Congress. How would Jasmine Crockett, a powerful black woman, respond when violence and racism collided in the very heart of the courtroom? This battle for justice would leave you wondering, can she overcome the tide of systemic oppression, or is the system too powerful to break? Charleston, South Carolina, an iconic city where the past never truly fades. Its cobblestone streets wind through neighborhoods steeped in history, and its grand buildings, with their intricate wooden doors and carved windows, stand like sentinels of a bygone era. Tourists come to admire the beauty, the charm, and the southern warmth, but beneath the surface, the city hides the weight of its painful legacy. Charleston's history is intertwined with bloodshed and struggle, the scars of wars, the deep divides of race, and the relentless fight for equality that continues to echo through its streets. Its polished exteriors mask a more complex truth, one where the past and present are forever locked in tension. On a crisp fall morning, as the sun's golden rays bathed the city, Jasmine Crockett, a black U.S. Congresswoman, stepped into Charleston's courthouse. She was not wearing a judge's robe or the formal attire typical of lawyers. She was dressed simply, nothing extravagant. Yet, in her posture and in the intensity of her eyes, there was an undeniable force. Jasmine wasn't here in any traditional role. She wasn't a judge. She wasn't a lawyer. She was a warrior, here to stand for those whose voices had long been silenced, here to confront the systems that had turned a blind eye for too long. As she walked into the courtroom, a profound silence fell over the room. Every footstep echoed in the stillness, measured and resolute, yet unhurried. The eyes of the room followed her, but not with admiration or reverence. They regarded her as an anomaly. A woman who, in their eyes, had no place here. She was just a black woman, a representative of a community long dismissed, in a city that had never fully reckoned with its past. In this space, her mere presence was a challenge to the status quo. It was a reminder that the world could no longer be defined by the old rules and that perhaps, just perhaps, things were about to change. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just any woman. She was a force, and the weight of her resolve pressed down on the room with a quiet intensity that everyone could feel but none could deny. As Boone stepped back, his hand still trembling from the slap that had left an indelible mark on the courtroom, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had underestimated her, mistaken her silence for weakness, her presence for insignificance. Jasmine's eyes, cold and unyielding, never left Boone's face. The slap was not just a physical strike, it was a symbolic one. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that he had built up over his career. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of power and privilege for those who upheld the unjust status quo. It became a battleground for something far more important, justice. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her posture unshaken, as the room held its breath. The silence stretched on, the tension thick in the air. Boone, now fully aware of the storm he had unleashed, stood frozen, unable to respond. The weight of his actions, the violence he had inflicted upon someone who had long been marginalized, began to dawn on him. The room shifted, the power dynamic subtly but irrevocably changing. It was as if the air itself had thickened with the presence of something undeniable, a reckoning. Jasmine had done what no one else had dared to do before. She had exposed the vulnerability of a system that had been shielded by years of complacency and denial. As she stood there, undeterred and unyielding, Jasmine Crockett became something more than just a congresswoman. She became the embodiment of every voice that had been silenced, every person who had been dismissed as insignificant, every injustice that had been swept under the rug. And she knew, in that moment, that the fight was no longer about her or her individual struggle. It was about the countless others who had been left behind, and she would not let them remain voiceless. Boone's arrogance had been his downfall. The system that had once protected him was crumbling, piece by piece, in the face of the truth that Jasmine had forced into the open. And as the silence lingered in the room, Jasmine knew that she had made her mark. The fight for justice had begun, and she was leading it. The silence in the courtroom became suffocating, but it was not the uncomfortable, uncertain silence of a crowd waiting for something to happen. It was the stillness before a storm, charged with anticipation, as if the very walls of the room were holding their breath. Jasmine stood unwavering, her posture as steady as a granite pillar, her expression calm but resolute. Her silence was deafening, like the calm before a violent storm, but those who were paying attention knew that her quiet was not born of fear or submission. It was the silence of someone who had decided that their next move would be one of purpose, not reaction. Boone shifted uneasily. He couldn't grasp what was happening, but he felt the pressure mounting. He had been the one to strike, but it was Jasmine who had all the power now. She had taken his slap and turned it into something far greater, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. While he stood there, rattled and confused, Jasmine stood tall, not a hint of submission in her demeanor. The room began to stir ever so slightly. A cough here, a shuffle of papers there. No one dared speak, but they were beginning to feel it, the shift, the unspoken reckoning. The question on everyone's mind was clear: what would Jasmine do next? Would she allow the system to crush her like so many had before? Or would she rise, not just for herself, but for all the others who had been silenced and oppressed by this same broken system? Jasmine knew this moment wasn't about the slap. It wasn't even about Boone. This was about the years of injustice, the years of unchecked power, and the years of people like Boone believing that they were invincible, that their actions would never be questioned. She wasn't here to prove anything to him. She was here to show everyone else what real courage looked like, what justice truly meant. As the tension mounted in the room, Jasmine took a small, deliberate step forward. Her eyes never left Boone's, but she wasn't looking for an apology, nor did she expect one. She was looking for something far more important: accountability. She was looking for the courage to confront the truth, to stand tall in the face of a system designed to silence her. Without a word, she raised her hand, not in anger, but in silent defiance. It was the gesture of someone who knew the weight of what had just transpired, but was not afraid to face it head-on. The room watched, holding its breath. Jasmine's hand moved towards the microphone, but she still didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, her action was enough. In that moment, she had taken control of the narrative. Boone, whose hand had struck her, was now the one who was small. He was the one who had to answer for his actions. The entire room, the whole city of Charleston, felt the shift. Finally, Jasmine spoke, but it wasn't with words of rage or defeat. Her voice was steady, clear, and cutting through the tension like a blade. "This," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Boone, "is not the end. This is the beginning." It was a simple declaration, but it carried the weight of everything she had been fighting for her entire life. The room knew it. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was a force. The question that had loomed over the courtroom, could she change the system, was no longer a question. It was an undeniable truth. The system was about to face its reckoning, and it had just begun. The silence stretched longer, becoming more suffocating. Jasmine Crockett's eyes never left Boone's. In that moment, she wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a symbol of everything that had been silenced, of every injustice and every story of oppression that had been ignored for far too long. The slap may have been a physical act, but her response, or lack thereof, had turned it into something more. It had become a statement that would echo throughout the courtroom and beyond, reverberating in every corner of the city, of the country. Boone, still standing there in the middle of the courtroom, fidgeted with his papers. His eyes shifted nervously, avoiding the weight of Jasmine's gaze. He had slapped a woman. A judge. A black woman. And he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the silence. He hadn't expected the power in it. For a fleeting moment, his confidence cracked. Was this the moment that would mark the end of his untouchable career? Was this the moment that the world would start seeing him for who he truly was? Jasmine's stillness was not just a refusal to give Boone the satisfaction of a reaction. It was deliberate. It was calculated. Her silence was like the calm before a storm, and in the space between each second, she was preparing herself. For the first time in her life, she understood the true weight of the system she was fighting against. It wasn't just a battle against one man or one moment. It was the culmination of centuries of abuse, neglect, and denial. This moment, this slap, was just the spark. The tension in the room began to shift. Those in the courtroom who had once been content to sit idly by, simply observing, now found themselves pulled into the gravity of the situation. Some whispered, unsure of what was happening, others were simply stunned, unable to tear their eyes away from the woman who was challenging the very foundations of the system. No one dared to breathe too loudly. No one dared to speak. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. And then, when Jasmine finally spoke, her voice broke the silence like a thunderclap, clear and resolute. "I will not be dismissed," she said, her tone unwavering. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an entire movement. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a battleground for justice, a stage for everything that had been left unsaid for far too long. Boone took a step back, his face flushed with confusion and panic. He couldn't understand why his power, which had always been absolute in his mind, had faltered in the presence of one woman's unshakable resolve. He tried to regain control of the room, but the power he once held seemed to slip further and further from his grasp. Jasmine's words weren't just a challenge to him, they were a challenge to the entire system. Her presence, her silence, her strength in that moment, had shattered the illusion of control. What followed wouldn't be immediate, and it wouldn't be easy. But the fight had begun, and it was clear now that it was no longer just about winning one case, or one battle. It was about dismantling a system that had been complicit in perpetuating injustice for far too long. The room remained still, but the energy had shifted. Jasmine Crockett was not just standing in the courtroom. She was standing for every individual who had been marginalized, every voice that had been suppressed, every life that had been ignored. She wasn't just responding to a slap, she was responding to the call for justice that had echoed for generations. And as the silence deepened, everyone knew that something profound had just begun. Power, in this moment, belonged to Jasmine Crockett. Her silent defiance, her unyielding gaze, and the deliberate calmness with which she moved had transformed the room. What had been a space of routine, of hierarchy, and of power struggles was now a battleground for something much deeper, justice. Boone's heart raced, but he could no longer act. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He had slapped a woman, yes, a judge, but it was more than that. He had struck a symbol of everything he thought he could control, a black woman, unassuming, silent, without a rope to cloak her authority. He had thought her silence was weakness, her stillness submission. But in the face of his assault, he had unwittingly given her the very weapon she needed to dismantle his power. The room, which had once been a place of fear and unease, was now simmering with the electric hum of impending change. Jasmine had shifted the narrative. It wasn't the story of a man striking a woman, it was the story of a woman who would no longer be silenced, who would not stand idly by while the powers that be trampled over justice. Her silence was an unspoken roar. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, as the question she had posed to Boone reverberated through the walls. The system, the very foundation of the courtroom, had been called into question. Jasmine's voice, though quiet, was the loudest thing anyone had heard that day. "What kind of system do we have?" she had asked, "when those who are supposed to protect and serve, when those who are supposed to uphold justice, can act with such impunity?" Her eyes locked on Boone's, daring him to answer. But the truth was, he couldn't. There was no answer for his actions. There was no defense for the power he had abused. In Jasmine's gaze, he saw the reflection of everything that had been wrong with the system for far too long, and for the first time, he understood the consequences of what he had done. It wasn't just a slap. It was the beginning of his unraveling. The silence in the room thickened. The people, once mere observers, now felt the weight of Jasmine's words. It wasn't just about Boone. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about a long history of abuse, inequality, and systemic racism. It was about standing up when everyone else remained quiet, about confronting the uncomfortable truths that others were too afraid to face. Jasmine sat there, poised and unwavering, her every move a reminder that power was not something that could be handed to you or taken from you. It was something that had to be claimed, something that had to be fought for. And she had just begun her fight. The realization spread through the room like wildfire. The energy was shifting. The sense of power was no longer tied to Boone, or any one individual. It was tied to the cause Jasmine was fighting for, the cause of truth, justice, and accountability. The cause of those who had been silenced for too long. Jasmine stood. Her eyes never leaving Boone, she walked slowly toward the bench, her every step resonating with the strength she had gained from the years of oppression, from every injustice she had faced, from every person who had tried to silence her. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence was enough. Every eye in the room followed her as she took her place, not as a judge in a robe, but as someone who had earned the right to be heard, to be respected. Boone shifted, unease still clouding his mind, but now it was something more, fear. The fear of a man who had never truly understood the weight of his actions, now fully realizing the extent of his mistake. He had not only struck a woman. He had struck a force. The courtroom had become a battleground for the soul of justice. And Jasmine Crockett, with her unshakable resolve, was leading the charge. The tension hung heavy in the air as everyone waited for her next move. But Jasmine knew, as they all did, that the real battle was only just beginning. The question now wasn't what Boone would do. It was what Jasmine would do next. What was she willing to risk? What was she willing to sacrifice to ensure that this moment wouldn't just fade into another chapter of forgotten history? The answer was clear in the calmness of her stance, in the unwavering certainty of her gaze. She wasn't here to be a footnote. She was here to make history. And nothing would silence her. The silence in the courtroom remained, but it was no longer oppressive. It was filled with possibility. And in that moment, the world knew Jasmine Crockett was a force to be reckoned with. The battle for justice had begun. Boone's entire world seemed to close in around him as Jasmine's words echoed through the courtroom. The walls, once symbols of authority and control, now felt like a cage that was slowly constricting around him. He had always believed that his badge, his position, and his entitlement shielded him from the consequences of his actions. But Jasmine Crockett was tearing that illusion apart, piece by piece. His eyes darted nervously, seeking escape, seeking comfort in the faces of his colleagues and the bystanders. But instead of finding support, he saw the faces of people who had witnessed this moment, people who had begun to understand that the power in this room did not rest with him anymore. They were the ones who had been silenced for too long, who had been subject to the oppressive system he represented. Now, those same people were watching him, waiting for him to answer, to face his actions. Jasmine had turned the courtroom into a battleground for justice, and in this fight, Boone found himself alone. He could no longer rely on his authority or the comfort of knowing he could silence those who challenged him. Jasmine's steady, unrelenting gaze was all that mattered now. She had positioned herself as the embodiment of the change that needed to happen, and Boone was on the wrong side of it. His throat tightened as he tried to respond, to regain his composure. But the words wouldn't come. Jasmine's every statement resonated with truth, and with each passing second, his excuses felt more hollow. She had become the mirror that forced him to face what he had done, what he had allowed to happen, and what he could no longer escape. He had underestimated her. More importantly, he had underestimated the power of those who had been oppressed for so long. In his arrogance, he had believed that his power was invincible, that he was above reproach. But Jasmine's quiet authority shattered that illusion. She had taken control without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic gesture. Her power came from her unshakable resolve, from her refusal to back down in the face of systemic injustice. Boone could feel the weight of the room pressing on him now. He was no longer the one in control. Jasmine was. And as she spoke, as she moved with deliberate calm toward him, he began to realize that the moment had passed him by. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of this system. And she had awakened something in the people around her. Something had shifted. As Jasmine stepped closer, her voice unwavering, she spoke once more, her words cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. You will face the truth, Boone. Whether you like it or not. Whether the system likes it or not. No one, not you or anyone else, will be allowed to escape the consequences of their actions any longer. Her words were simple but laden with immense power, a power that had nothing to do with the courtroom, the robe, or the title she held. It was a power that came from her unyielding spirit and her refusal to be silenced. She wasn't just confronting Boone now, she was confronting the entire system that had allowed men like him to act with impunity. Boone took a step back, unable to form a defense, unable to summon the courage to fight back. He was no longer the aggressor in this room. He was the one on trial. Jasmine's eyes never wavered from his, a silent promise that she would see this through, that no one would walk away from this moment without facing the consequences of their actions. The room held its breath. Everyone knew this was only the beginning. Jasmine wasn't finished. She was just getting started. and Boone, for the first time in his career, found himself on the receiving end of the justice he had long ignored. The silence in the courtroom deepened, heavy with the anticipation of what would come next. It wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. It was a turning point, a moment in history where the balance of power shifted, not because of the laws written on paper, but because of the indomitable will of one woman who had finally stood up to a system that had never been truly just. The question no longer lingered in the air. What will Jasmine do next? It was clear now. She would continue this fight, and she would win. Jasmine stood in the eye of the storm, her silence a force that carried more weight than any shouted accusation could. She had lived this moment for years in her mind, had seen it unfold in the dark recesses of her thoughts during quiet nights, in the courtroom halls, and in the faces of those who had come before her seeking justice. But now it was real. The weight of her mission, the weight of every person who had ever been wronged by this system, pressed down on her like an invisible hand, and she was the only one who could bear it. Boone stood frozen, his arrogance cracking as Jasmine's gaze pinned him in place. His shoulders sagged, and the confidence that had once radiated from him began to bleed away. Every breath he took seemed heavier than the last, as though the air itself had thickened with the pressure of the moment. He had always seen himself as untouchable, above the laws, above reproach. But Jasmine had shown him otherwise. He was no longer the one in control. He was the one exposed. Jasmine's voice, low but cutting, broke through the thick silence once more. This isn't about you, Boone. It's about all the people who've been buried beneath a system that allowed you to thrive on their suffering. It's about every person who has been silenced because the people in power are too afraid to speak out against their own. Each word she spoke was a mirror, reflecting not just Boone's wrongdoings, but the entire system that had enabled them. The years of injustice, the moments when power had been wielded carelessly and recklessly, the countless lives crushed under the weight of a justice system that was never truly just. Jasmine had spent her career fighting to change that, and now, this moment felt like the pivot point, the moment when everything could either shift or fall back into the shadows. You can't hide behind your badge anymore, Boone. Not in this room. Not under my watch. Jasmine's voice was steady, unrelenting. The truth she spoke had no need to be raised in volume. The quiet of her authority reverberated with the power of every word. Boone's eyes darted, seeking an escape, but there was nowhere left to run. His mind raced, scrambling for something, anything, to regain control, but nothing came. He had underestimated Jasmine, underestimated the depth of her resolve. His usual tricks, the arrogant posturing, the ability to intimidate and silence, no longer worked in her presence. The shift in power had been so subtle, so precise, that it was only now, as he stood on the edge of the abyss, that he realized how thoroughly he had lost. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, but Jasmine's mind was working furiously, weighing the cost of what was to come. She was no stranger to the dangers of standing alone against an entrenched system. She had seen others fall, had watched as those who fought with the same conviction were crushed under the weight of the very institutions they sought to dismantle. Her heart raced with the knowledge that this was the risk she had always feared, fighting for justice in a system that was designed to keep power in the hands of the few. But Jasmine knew one thing with unshakable certainty: if she didn't do this, who would? If she didn't fight, who would carry the torch for all those whose voices had been stolen? You will not walk away from this, Boone, Jasmine continued, her voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. This system may have let you think you were untouchable, but you are just one piece of a much larger machine. And I will not stop until every piece of it is exposed for what it truly is. Boone opened his mouth, but no words came out. His arrogance, his confidence, his sense of entitlement, all of it had been stripped away, leaving him standing there, vulnerable and exposed. Jasmine's words had cut through him, not just as a condemnation, but as a stark reminder of the truth he had spent so long avoiding. The truth that now loomed over him like an unrelenting shadow. The courtroom watched in rapt attention, waiting for the moment when Jasmine would strike, when she would bring Boone to his knees, when justice would be served. But Jasmine didn't need to strike. She had already won. The system that had upheld Boone, that had protected him and people like him for so long, was now on trial. And in that moment, Jasmine realized something profound. It wasn't just about holding Boone accountable, it was about dismantling the very structure that allowed his actions to go unchallenged. It was about a future where this moment of reckoning wasn't a one-time event, but the beginning of a new era of justice. Jasmine stood her ground, eyes locked on Boone, but her mind was already beyond him, beyond the confines of the courtroom. She was ready for the next battle, the next fight. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew the system would push back, that she would face resistance from every corner, but she was ready. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a judge. She was a force of change. And this time, the system wouldn't crush her. It would have to reckon with her. Boone with his actions and words symbolized the abuse of power. He represented the system that had long protected those who could wield influence and control without consequence. Jasmine Crockett could not let that oppression continue. She had seen the scars of the system, the broken lives, the silenced voices, the people who had been discarded by a legal apparatus designed to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. Jasmine closed her eyes for a brief second, took a deep breath, and tried to calm the storm rising in her chest. She wasn't someone easily defeated. But even so, in this moment, she couldn't help but ask herself, do I have the strength to change the system? Will I survive this battle, or will I just become another victim in a long line of those consumed by the system I'm fighting against? Each question she asked herself made her more resolute in the path she had chosen. She wasn't fighting just for herself, but for others, the ones forgotten in the silence of society. She thought of those who had died in courtrooms, their names long forgotten. She thought of all the people she had met throughout her career, those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And she knew that if she didn't do this, no one would. Boone still stood there, but he no longer held the confidence he once did. His eyes now showed anxiety, yet he couldn't speak. Jasmine knew Boone couldn't escape the truth. She had started to expose the truth about him, the past he had worked so hard to hide. She looked at him once more and repeated the question, but this time her voice was no longer challenging. It was stern. Boone, who do you think I am, and who do I represent in this courtroom? She let the question hang in the air, giving everyone in the room a moment to reflect. In Jasmine's eyes, Boone was no longer a powerful police officer. He was a man standing before the truth, before a system that was being challenged. But the more important question remained, could Jasmine change the system, or would she just become part of the futile efforts of those who had failed before her? The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye was locked on Jasmine Crockett. After a series of sharp questions and decisive statements, she was no longer just a woman standing before the court. She had become the one standing up against a whole system of power, a system that had long upheld division and injustice. Jasmine's gaze never wavered from Boone. Her eyes were cold but strong, like a sharp blade cutting through the arrogance that shielded him. Jasmine stood firm, unmoving, and her silence made the air in the room feel thick, each passing second growing heavier. Everyone knew that this confrontation was not just about seeking justice for an individual. It was a battle against a system that protected those who abused their power. No one in the room could take their eyes off her, for Jasmine had wagered everything on one challenge, the justice she had fought for all these years. Boone, I demand all the evidence and testimonies related to the arrest of that teenage boy be presented immediately, Jasmine said, her voice as hard as steel. Not a hint of hesitation. She wasn't just demanding fairness for the boy who had been arrested by Boone for vandalism, but she was also demanding justice for herself and for everyone who had been wronged by him. Boone flinched, unable to believe what he had just heard. He thought he could abuse his power without anyone daring to challenge him. He had grown accustomed to ignoring complaints, to hiding the stains on his police record under the rug of silence and power. But now everything was different. Jasmine wasn't just facing him as a judge. She was demanding the truth he had tried to deny for years. Jasmine continued, unhurried, but each word she spoke pushed Boone further into a corner he couldn't escape. You think you can keep abusing your power without anyone noticing? The boy's testimony will not be overlooked. Your dirty record will not be erased. It's time for you to pay for your actions. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Everyone in the courtroom could feel that this was no simple confrontation between a defendant and a police officer. This was Jasmine's fight for justice for the people who had been abandoned by this legal system, and more importantly, for those who had no chance to speak out, like the teenage boy Boone had arrested. One of the lawyers in the room stood up but didn't dare speak. The reporters with cameras began recording every word Jasmine said, knowing this was the moment when all truths would be laid bare. Meanwhile, Boone felt as though he was being torn apart from the inside. He knew his career and the entire system he relied on would crumble if the evidence came to light. Jasmine didn't stop. For this boy, for the others, and for myself, all the evidence related to this arrest must be presented immediately. I demand that everyone in this room record what is happening, because today justice will not be defeated. I will not let silence continue to protect those who abuse their power. Her eyes locked on Boone. But this time it wasn't just him who felt the tension. The people in the room began to understand that Jasmine wasn't just a judge running the trial. She was someone standing up for justice, someone ready to break down the walls of injustice that this system had built. Boone was no longer the powerful police officer he thought he was. He was a pawn in a much larger game that had now been exposed. Jasmine had delivered a powerful blow, and he could not escape it. Jasmine sat down, not needing to say anything more. She had made everything clear, and now all eyes were on Boone, standing in silent shame. He could not defend himself. He could not deny. He could not hide anymore. Jasmine had forced the truth into the light. And in that moment, the courtroom seemed to explode, with all attention now focused on him, the embodiment of the injustice he represented. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Jasmine Crockett was no longer the judge sitting silently behind the bench. Nor was she simply the one making cold, calculated statements. She had become a true warrior in the fight against the injustice that had long allowed people like Boone to sit on their throne of power and oppression. Jasmine could no longer bear it. She had made the decision. She would not remain silent for another second. Her eyes locked on Boone, cold and resolute. She didn't need to raise her voice to assert her power. One simple question from her was enough to silence the entire room, sparking questions that could not be answered about discrimination and power. Her question wasn't a typical challenge. It was a powerful accusation, a call for justice rising from wounds that had been ignored for far too long. Boone, she began, her voice as cold as ice, each word as sharp as a knife. If I were a white judge, would you dare do this? The question exploded in the air like a bomb, startling everyone in the courtroom. Those around them froze, their eyes no longer on Boone, but on Jasmine. The question was not just a challenge to Boone. It was a powerful statement about the racism she had faced for years. Boone stood frozen for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what had just been said. He didn't know how to respond. Jasmine had struck right at the weakness he couldn't deny. For the first time in his career, Boone felt fear, not for himself, but for the truth being exposed right before his eyes. He had always thought that as a long-serving police officer, he could do anything without being questioned or monitored. He had grown accustomed to using his power to do whatever he wanted, even when his actions were wrong. But now, Jasmine Crockett had opened a door that Boone could no longer close. Her question had stripped away the discrimination he had tried to bury. There was no answer from Boone, only silence. And that silence was an unspoken admission. Her question wasn't just an assertion of the injustice Jasmine had endured. It was a bold condemnation of the entire system, a system that Boone represented. This question had shifted everything in the room. No longer were there simple statements or meaningless confrontations. Jasmine had opened the door to a real battle. A battle not just against a police officer, but against an entire system that had long protected people like Boone. No more silence. No more tolerance. Jasmine Crockett had stood up. And she was not just representing herself. She was the voice for all those who had been oppressed. Those who had never had the chance to speak within this legal system. When Jasmine asked that question, Boone knew the fight couldn't end simply. There was no way for him to escape that question. No way to run from the truth. And in Jasmine's sharp gaze, he understood that not only the boy he had arrested would receive justice, he too would face the consequences of his actions. Everyone in the room began to realize that this wasn't just a personal confrontation. This was Jasmine's fight for all those who had been abandoned by the system. She was not just the judge in this case. She was a representative of an ideal that everyone needed to rise up to protect. Justice cannot be abused, and racism cannot continue to exist. Boone stood there, his body stiff, his face once filled with arrogance and self-assurance, now slowly cracking under the cold gaze of Jasmine Crockett. Boone's thoughts were spiraling, each one crashing into the next like waves on jagged rocks. Everything he had once believed to be certain, the power he wielded with such ease, the confidence he'd placed in the system that had always shielded him, was now slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers, sinking deep into the earth, beyond his reach. The question that had always lingered in the back of his mind, one he had worked so hard to avoid confronting, was finally breaking through. Could he escape Jasmine's scrutiny? Could he escape the justice system she represented, the one that was now taking form before his very eyes? The truth he had long denied was growing larger with every passing second, and for the first time, Boone wasn't sure of himself. Jasmine's cold words rang in his ears. Her sharp questions felt like daggers, each one piercing deeper into his consciousness. Boone had always believed himself untouchable. He had walked through the world with a sense of authority that nothing could challenge. He had been above the law, protected by the very system that was now turning on him. But in the face of Jasmine, everything he had once known was crumbling. He was being exposed for who he truly was, a man who had used the power of the badge for far too long without consequence. His mind was a blur. Every question Jasmine asked pushed him further into a corner, trapping him in a cage of his own making. It wasn't just the scrutiny he feared, it was the realization that there was no way out. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. He couldn't hide. And this fear, this unfamiliar sensation, was something Boone had never known. It wasn't physical fear, he had faced danger countless times, but this was different. This was the fear of his entire life, his career, his beliefs, all being shattered in an instant. Boone's eyes flicked around the room, desperately seeking someone, anyone, to offer him support. His gaze landed on fellow officers, but none met his eyes. They were silent, passive, distant. They were no longer his allies. In this moment, they had no power, no influence. No one was coming to save him. The room felt like a pressure cooker, with all eyes locked onto him, the weight of their gaze suffocating him. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a judge anymore. She wasn't merely the voice of the courtroom. She had become a symbol of something far greater, something Boone couldn't ignore, the very cause he had spent his career dismissing. Jasmine had shattered his illusions, pulling down the facade he had carefully built around himself. She was the embodiment of justice, and she was forcing him to confront the very system he had come to depend on, one that had long allowed him to abuse his power without question. As Jasmine continued to question him, each word felt like a punch to his stomach. The truth was undeniable, and Boone knew it. He had long relied on the protective cloak of the police system, using it to shield himself from accountability. But that cloak was now in tatters. Jasmine had torn through it with precision, exposing the cracks beneath. The very system that had once protected him was now being dragged into the light, and Boone could feel the ground beneath him begin to shift. Fear spread slowly through his body, a cold chill creeping up his spine. Had he ever truly felt fear before? He wondered. He had always believed he could control every situation, bend it to his will. He had never been afraid to stand before a defendant or confront a fellow officer. But now, as he stood before Jasmine, he felt powerless. He felt small. He felt exposed. It wasn't just her questions that unnerved him, it was the certainty in her voice, the unshakable belief in her cause. Jasmine wasn't just trying to win a case. She was trying to dismantle everything he had ever believed in. Boone looked at her, his gaze heavy with tension. There was no way to deny it now. He could see the strength in her eyes, the resolve that had been building for years. She wasn't just fighting for one person or one case. She was fighting for an entire system to be held accountable. She wasn't afraid to confront the powerful and demand that they face justice. Jasmine had shattered his arrogance, broken through the walls he had carefully constructed around himself, and forced him to ask himself the questions he had always avoided. Could she dismantle the system he had long relied on? Could she make him pay for everything he had done? These questions hung in the air like an inescapable truth, and Boone didn't have the answers. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The courtroom fell silent, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of tension, it was the silence of impending collapse. Every person in the room knew that this was the moment when everything would change. All eyes were on Jasmine now, watching her every move. No one dared to breathe too loudly, for they knew that this battle was far more than a confrontation between a judge and an officer. It was the clash of two worlds, one built on power and privilege, the other on the pursuit of truth and justice. Jasmine Crockett was not one to show mercy. She had made it clear from the moment she had stepped into the courtroom. She would not allow someone like Boone to continue to exist within a system that had long nurtured injustice. She had seen enough. She had fought enough. And now, with a single glance, she had made Boone understand the game had changed. The system that had once protected him was now turning against him. Jasmine had become the force that would unravel it all. Boone stood frozen, the color draining from his face as Jasmine's unwavering gaze pressed down on him. Her eyes weren't just the eyes of a judge, they were the eyes of someone who had seen the system's darkest truths, who knew the depth of its rot. Every layer of protection Boone had once relied on, every excuse he had clung to, crumbled under the weight of her scrutiny. He felt it. He knew it was over. He couldn't even muster the words to deny it. He had no justification left, no defense he could offer that would hold any weight. This wasn't just about the assault, not anymore. This was about everything he had done, everything the system had allowed him to do, without consequence. Jasmine wasn't just demanding justice for the teenage boy he had arrested. She was demanding accountability for him and for everyone like him who had used their power without ever fearing retribution. Jasmine remained calm, but every movement she made was deliberate, her presence as imposing as the words she spoke. Her hands rested firmly on the bench, her back straight. She wasn't going to bend. She wasn't going to flinch. She didn't need to raise her voice, every syllable she uttered struck with the precision of a weapon. "Boone," Jasmine said, her voice clear, cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. "I demand that you be held accountable for your actions." The room was still. Every eye in the courtroom was locked onto Jasmine, and even Boone, who had always believed he could control a room with his presence, found himself shrinking under her stare. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of the moment. She didn't wait for him to speak, didn't give him an ounce of room for excuses. "There is no reason, no excuse that justifies what you did," Jasmine continued. "Not stress, not an accident. You assaulted me, and that is unacceptable." The words hung in the air, unwavering, as if the very atmosphere in the courtroom had turned into a living, breathing testament to truth. Boone's mouth went dry. He had no defense. No words of justification. He couldn't even think of a single excuse that would make sense in this moment. Jasmine had stripped him bare. There was no room for denial, no place for the comforting lies he had used to shield himself for so long. Then Jasmine stepped out from behind the bench. Her movements were deliberate, confident, closing the distance between them in a way that left no space between the abuser and the one he had wronged. She stood directly in front of him, and for the first time in his life, Boone felt small, helpless, like a child caught in a lie. She was no longer just a figure of authority in a courtroom. She was something more, something formidable. "You cannot justify your actions, Boone," she said, her voice now tinged with fury, a fierce undercurrent of emotion breaking through her calm exterior. "You can't blame stress or lack of awareness. You struck me, a judge, right here in this courtroom, and your actions are inexcusable." The words pierced through Boone's fragile defense, and the weight of the truth came crashing down on him. He felt suffocated by his own guilt. He wanted to protest. He wanted to scream that he never meant to do it, that it was a mistake, but he couldn't. He couldn't escape the reality that Jasmine had set before him. The cage he had built for himself, his complacency, his abuse of power, his dependence on a system that shielded him, was closing in on him from every angle. Boone stood there, trapped in the prison of his own making, and Jasmine's voice rang out again, this time directed not just at him, but at everyone in the room. She was sending a message. A declaration. Her words weren't just condemning one man's actions. They were aimed at the entire system, exposing its deep-seated corruption. "You see, Boone will be held accountable for his actions," Jasmine said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But this isn't just about him. This is a reminder to all of us that we cannot continue to live in a system where power is abused without consequence." The courtroom was silent, but now there was a palpable shift. The people in the room, whether they realized it or not, understood what Jasmine was saying. They understood the depth of her words. "This system," she continued, her voice steady and resolute, "must face the truth. I will not allow silence to continue protecting those who abuse their power." Jasmine stood tall, her arms crossed in front of her, every word she spoke carrying the weight of years of oppression, years of injustice. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She had become something more, an agent of change, a warrior fighting for the oppressed, for those whose voices had been drowned out by the system's corruption. Her words rang out like a declaration of war. This wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. It was about dismantling the very system that had enabled people like Boone to run rampant without fear of repercussion. No more silence, Jasmine said, her voice unwavering. No more actions hidden behind the mask of power. The truth will be heard. The silence in the courtroom was thick, but it wasn't just a silence of tension, it was the silence before a storm. Jasmine had set the stage, and Boone was no longer the one in control. He had been exposed. He had been stripped of his power. The weight of his actions and the system that had protected him now stood bare for all to see. Jasmine had fought not just for justice in this courtroom, but for a truth that could no longer be denied. And in that moment, Boone realized that he wasn't the only one who would pay. The system itself, one he had relied on for so long, was on trial, too. The only question that remained was, would it survive the truth that Jasmine had brought to light? Jasmine Crockett stood tall in the courtroom, her heart racing, but her resolve unwavering. Boone, the police officer she had spent months building a case against, stood silently, unable to offer any defense. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, but the silence between them was deafening. The tension in the room confirmed what everyone knew: Jasmine had won, not just in this trial, but in the battle against a deeply entrenched system of injustice. A system that had long allowed figures like Boone to escape accountability. But Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. Her victory in the courtroom had been significant, but it was a single battle in a war that spanned years, decades, and generations. She was up against a system built on shadows, on power that had operated with impunity for far too long. With each step she took, those in power felt the ground shifting beneath them. And they would fight back. The morning after the trial, Jasmine walked into her office, feeling the weight of the world. The atmosphere was charged, as though the calm before a storm had settled over her. She could feel the invisible hands of the powerful forces that had been watching her. Forces that would stop at nothing to preserve their hold on the system. Jasmine understood this more than anyone. She had known from the start that she would face fierce resistance. The first to appear was Chief Nolan, the head of the city's police force. He had been absent from the courtroom the day before, but his presence now was undeniable. His cold, steely eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was here to deliver a warning. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had anticipated this confrontation. Nolan's voice was low, chilling. "Jasmine, you're not someone easily subdued. But you need to understand something: what you're doing will not be allowed to continue. The system can't be threatened, and you won't change it." Jasmine met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not doing this for you, Nolan. I'm doing this for the people who've been crushed by the system for too long. The ones you've forgotten. And I'm not going to stop until this system is held accountable for every person it's hurt." Nolan's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. He had expected resistance, but not this. "You don't understand, Jasmine. You're up against something you can't defeat. The system is bigger than you, and it will swallow you whole." Jasmine stood her ground. "I know what I'm up against. But if you think I'll back down, you're wrong. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Nolan said nothing. His silence spoke volumes, and as he left her office, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This fight was far from over. The system would not let her win so easily. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. Whispers filled the air. Some of Jasmine's colleagues, once allies in her pursuit of justice, began to waver. Mysterious calls, threats, and subtle pressure began to erode their resolve. It was clear to Jasmine that the powers that be had mobilized against her. But she wouldn't back down. Not now. She knew that when one person stood up for justice, all the dark forces of the system would come crashing down on them. But it was that very resistance that proved she was on the right path. Jasmine's words in the courtroom had ignited a spark, but now the fire was beginning to spread. Days turned into weeks, and as Jasmine dug deeper into the case against Boone, she discovered a disturbing truth. Boone wasn't the only one. There were others, hidden in the shadows, whose crimes had been covered up for years. The corruption within the police force ran deeper than she had imagined. The more she uncovered, the more she realized this wasn't just about one man, it was about a system designed to protect people like him. Jasmine began requesting old case files, investigating reports that had been buried, and seeking out witnesses who might be willing to speak. But it wasn't easy. The deeper she dug, the more the walls seemed to close in around her. Threats came in the form of phone calls, anonymous messages, and even veiled warnings from colleagues. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Then, one morning, as she was poring over the case files, her phone rang. It was someone from Internal Affairs. They wanted to meet. When they did, the message was clear: if Jasmine continued her investigation, she would face consequences. The powers that be had made it clear they would not allow her to expose the rot within their ranks. But Jasmine wasn't scared. She had already made up her mind. The system might be designed to protect those in power, but Jasmine had seen the darkness within. She knew that she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. With renewed determination, she dove deeper into the investigation. Each new lead, each new piece of evidence, only confirmed what she had suspected all along: this wasn't just about Boone. It was about a culture of corruption, about the network of people who protected one another, who abused their power with impunity. But Jasmine also knew that if she was to uncover the truth, she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people who had the courage to stand with her. But even as she reached out to potential allies, she found that many of them were hesitant, afraid of the system's reach and its ability to destroy those who dared to challenge it. Still, Jasmine pressed on. She couldn't let herself be silenced. Every time she felt the walls closing in, she reminded herself why she was doing this. For the victims of abuse, for those who had been denied justice for far too long. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person the system had crushed under its heel. But as the days wore on, Jasmine found herself facing a new challenge. The system had begun to push back in ways she hadn't anticipated. The police reports about Boone were leaked, undermining her investigation. Witnesses she had hoped would testify began to withdraw, afraid of what might happen to them. The deeper she dug, the more obstacles she encountered. Yet every time the system tried to crush her, Jasmine's resolve only grew stronger. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But Jasmine was no stranger to adversity. She had spent her life fighting against injustice. And now, she was determined to see this fight through to the end, no matter what it cost her. With each new piece of evidence, each new ally who joined her cause, Jasmine felt the weight of the system pressing in from all sides. But she would not be intimidated. She would continue to expose the truth, even if it meant facing threats, losing friends, or putting everything on the line. Jasmine Crockett had come too far to turn back now. The system may have been built to protect the powerful, but Jasmine would be the one to tear it down. She had been through too much to stop now. Justice, after all, was worth fighting for, even if it meant standing alone. And Jasmine was never truly alone. The truth was on her side, and that was all she needed to keep fighting. Jasmine Crockett had been in the fight of her life, and the battle wasn't just against one man, it was against a corrupt system that had allowed people like Boone to thrive unchecked for far too long. Exhausted, disappointed, and feeling the weight of a seemingly impenetrable wall before her, she knew the stakes. The system was powerful not because of people like Boone alone, but because it had the protection of those in higher places, those who benefited from its corruption and perpetuated its injustices. As Jasmine gazed out her office window, the weak afternoon light cast long shadows across her thoughts. She was tired, and her mind was clouded with doubt. Could she really change this? Could she break through a system that had been built and reinforced over decades by the powerful? Was she simply pushing against a wall that would never crumble, no matter how hard she fought? The doubt gnawed at her. Her friends, once hopeful changemakers in the system, had walked away. They had seen the harsh realities, the crushing weight of power, corruption, and a system that crushed all those who tried to challenge it. Some of them had given up because they couldn't take the constant disappointment. Jasmine wondered if she had the strength to keep going. If she didn't, Boone and people like him would continue to abuse their power, and the system would keep turning a blind eye. But Jasmine knew there was too much at stake. She couldn't walk away. Not when so many had been crushed beneath the system's weight. Not when so many had been forgotten, neglected, and ignored. She had to fight for justice, no matter how much the road ahead seemed impossible. Her victory wasn't just about one officer, it wasn't even about Boone. It was about taking down a corrupt network of power that had been operating unchecked for far too long. Jasmine knew that this was bigger than one case. It was about making sure that justice was more than just a word, it had to be a reality that could be fought for and won. As the courtroom buzzed in anticipation, the tension was palpable. But it wasn't just the verdict that held everyone on edge. It was the message Jasmine had sent. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been victimized by the system. When Boone was taken into custody, his once smug demeanor finally shattered, and Jasmine felt a sense of relief and satisfaction. But there was more to it. This wasn't just personal, it was a victory for justice, for fairness, and for every person who had suffered in silence. In that moment, Jasmine knew that her victory was not just about securing one conviction, it was about sending a clear message to the system. The corrupt system that allowed people like Boone to operate unchecked, that protected those who wielded power and ignored the cries of the oppressed, was no longer safe from scrutiny. No one, no matter their rank or position, was immune from facing the consequences of their actions. Jasmine had changed the conversation, and in doing so, she showed that justice could be achieved even against the most powerful forces. But the fight didn't end with Boone's arrest. What people didn't see was the much larger system she was up against. Jasmine wasn't just fighting one police officer, she was challenging a network of power, corruption, and bias that had been allowed to operate without any real checks or balances. The system fought back, of course. There were attempts to discredit her, smear campaigns to undermine her credibility, and efforts to delegitimize the case. But Jasmine refused to back down. The more resistance she faced, the more determined she became. Through her relentless pursuit of justice, Jasmine began to peel back the layers of the system. She uncovered lies, exposed connections, and unearthed decades of corruption. She made it clear that no longer would those in power be allowed to sweep their misdeeds under the rug. Her tenacity began to inspire others. Witnesses who had once been silent, too afraid to speak out against the system, now found the courage to come forward. Officers, prosecutors, and officials who had once been protected by the system were now being held accountable. As the walls that had protected the corrupt began to crumble, Jasmine's case was no longer just a fight for one individual, it was a battle for the integrity of the entire system. One by one, the powerful figures who had evaded justice for so long were brought to account. And when it was all over, Jasmine didn't just win a case. She won a battle for justice. She restored a sense of fairness to a people who had been ignored for far too long. But her victory wasn't just personal. It was a triumph for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had long been indifferent to their suffering. Jasmine's unwavering determination proved that even against overwhelming odds, justice could still prevail. She had become more than just a judge. She had become a symbol of resilience and courage, a beacon of light in the darkness of injustice. Jasmine understood that change couldn't happen overnight. But she also knew that if no one stood up, the system would continue to perpetuate harm. Her fight wasn't just about the cases before her, it was about dismantling a system that had been built on corruption and silence. Jasmine proved that only resilience, courage, and an unyielding stance against injustice could break it apart. When those in power tried everything to shield themselves, when forces stronger than her tried to suppress her voice, Jasmine stood tall. She showed that no matter how mighty the system seemed, it could still be brought to justice. Her victory sent a powerful message: no one, no matter their power, was beyond the reach of the law. Her courage proved that justice could indeed be achieved, even against insurmountable odds. Jasmine's story serves as a powerful reminder: justice is not always easy to attain, and it may require facing unimaginable challenges, but it is worth fighting for. Through each setback, she only grew stronger in her resolve. The pursuit of truth and justice cannot be bought, it must be fought for. Jasmine's story teaches an essential lesson: no matter your position, no matter how powerful the system, you can make a difference. She didn't just win a court case, she won a long-standing battle against a system that had left so many people forgotten in the shadows of injustice. Her victory proved that justice, no matter how late it may come, can still be found if we never give up. In the end, Jasmine Crockett became a model of persistence and courage. She showed that even in the face of corruption and power abuse, truth and justice will always triumph. Her victory wasn't just personal, it was a victory for a fairer society, for those who had long been silenced, and for every person who believed that justice could be more than just an ideal. Jasmine's legacy would live on as proof that, no matter how powerful the forces against you may seem, the truth will always rise to the surface.